picking up in Paul Johnson's History of the Jews. In the first portion, Part 1, Israelites, page 62, beginning with the second paragraph. Much of the wealth Solomon derived from trade and taxes he poured into the royal capital. He built a sumptuous royal palace with a great hypostyle hall, on the lines of Pharaoh's palaces at Memphis, Luxor, and elsewhere. Its cedarwood roof, supported by 45 enormous wooden pillars, what the Bible calls the house of the forest of Lebanon. A separate palace was built for his chief wife, the Egyptian, since she kept her own pagan faith. My wife shall not dwell in the house of David of Israel, because the places are holy, whereunto the ark of the Lord hath come. Palace and royal quarter, barracks and inner fortifications were close to a new sacred quarter or temple, the whole being accommodated by extending the city of David 250 yards to the east. There is now nothing visible left of Solomon's Jerusalem, since it was either submerged beneath the enormous temple building which Herod the Great later erected, or quarried away by the Romans. We are dependent entirely on literary sources, chapters 6 to 7 of the first books of the Kings, for our description of Solomon's temple. But the details thus supplied show that it was similar to late Bronze Age Canaanite temples at Lachish and Beth Shan, and a somewhat later 9th century BC temple excavated at Tel Tanet in Assyria. Like these, Solomon's had 3 rooms, each 33 feet wide, on an axis. The olam, or porch, 16 feet long, the hekel, or holy room, 66 feet long, and the Holy of Holies, a square of 33 feet, which was kept entirely dark like the inner sanctum in an Egyptian temple. This building was put up and equipped in a manner quite alien to the Israelites. Phoenician masons dressed the stone ashlars. Hiram of Tyre also sent an expert in bronze, a namesake, to cast the temple's ceremonial vessels. These included a basin on wheels, a bronze laver on a stand, similar to pagan ones found at Megiddo and in Cyprus, and the great molten sea, containing 2,000 baths of water, used by the priests for the pre-sacrificial lustrations, which stood on 12 bronze oxen. 2 bronze pillars, Boaz and Jachin, each nearly 40 feet high, perhaps corresponding to the standing monoliths of the Canaanite high places, protected a gold-covered altar with 10 gold candlesticks. The screen of the Holy of Holies was also of hanging gold chains. Cedar lined the floor and walls. The Holy of Holies, with its protective wooden cherubim covered in gold, was built to contain the venerated cult relics of the ancient religion of Yahweh. The Ark of the Covenant, first and foremost, and according to Talmud tradition, the staff of Moses, Aaron's rod, the manna jar, and the pillow on which Jacob's head rested when he had his latter dream. But by the time Jerusalem fell in 587 BC, all these things had long since disappeared, and one must doubt whether they were ever there in the first place. Must one? Personal footnote. What is clear is that Solomon's temple, in its size and magnificence, and in its location within the fortified walls of a royal upper city or acropolis, had very little to do with the pure religion of Yahweh, which Moses brought out of the wilderness. The Jews later came to see Solomon's temple as an essential part of the early faith, but that is not how it must have appeared at the time to pious men beyond the royal circle, like the corvée, the tax districts, the chariots. It was new, and in many ways simply copied from the more advanced pagan cultures of the Mediterranean coast or the Nile Valley. Was not Solomon embracing paganism along with his foreign wives, his centralized monarchy, and his ruthless ways with the old tribes? Was not his temple an idolatrous place where objects were worshipped? The ark itself must have looked out of place in its magnificent surroundings. It was just a wooden chest 4 feet long, 2 feet 6 inches deep, carried on poles, passing through rings on each side. Inside it were the tablets of the law. In strict Israelite belief, the ark was simply a repository of God's commandments. It was not a cult object to be worshipped. Yet they were confused on this point, just as they were confused in their belief that God, though unrepresentable, had made man in his image. One of the old primitive temples at Dan actually had a statue of God, though the ark was built to carry the tablets. The Israelites seem to have attached divine powers to God's words, so in a sense they believed the deity lived in the ark. They related portions of the wilderness years accordingly. And it came to pass, when the ark set forward, that Moses said, Rise up, Lord, and let thine enemies be scattered, and let them that hate thee flee before thee. And when it rested, he said, Return, O Lord, unto the many thousands of Israel. Solomon took advantage of this confusion to push forward his religious reform in the direction of royal absolutism, in which the king controlled the sole shrine where God could be effectively worshipped. In chapters 8 of the first book of Kings, Solomon emphasized that God was in the temple. I have surely built thee an house to dwell in, a settled place for thee to abide in forever. But Solomon was not a pure pagan, as this would imply, for if so, he would not have bothered to exclude his pagan wife from the sacred area. He understood the theology of his religion, for he asked, But will indeed God dwell on the earth? Behold, the heaven and heaven of heavens cannot contain thee, how much less this house that I have builded? He effected a compromise between his state needs and his understanding of Israelite monotheism by supposing not a physical but a symbolic presence of the Almighty. That thine eyes may be open towards this house night and day, even towards the place of which thou hast said, My name shall be there. This was the way in which later generations fitted the temple into the faith, the presence of the name of God alone in the Holy of Holies, generating a powerful divine radiation called the Shekinah, which destroyed any unauthorized person who approached it. But at the time, the notion of a central royal temple was objectionable to many Israelite purists. They formed the first of the many separatist sects the religion of Yahweh was to breed, the Rechabites. Many northern Many Northerners, too, resented the concentration of the religion in Jerusalem and its royal temple, for the priesthood, which served it soon, but forward absolutist demands, claiming that only their ceremonies were valid, and that the older shrines and temples, the high places and the altars venerated since patriarchal times, were a nest of heterodoxy and wickedness. These assertions ultimately prevailed and became biblical orthodoxy, but at the time they met resistance in the north. This hostility to Solomon's religious chances, combined with his absolutist ways and exactions to make the United Kingdom his father had constructed untenable in the long run. Solomon's craft and success held it together, but there were signs of strain even during his last years. To Israelites, for whom the past was very real, the forced labor system was particularly odious because it reminded them of the Egyptian servitude. Their freedom and their religion were inseparable in their minds. By concentrating the cult in Jerusalem, Solomon downgraded northern shrines such as Shechem, associated with Abraham, and Bethel with Jacob. To the northerners, then Solomon and his line were increasingly seen as spiritual destroyers as well as secular oppressors. Hence, when Solomon died in 925 to 926 BC, the northerners refused his successor, Rehoboam, a united coronation in Jerusalem, and insisted he go north to Shechem to be crowned their king. Men who had fled to exile under Solomon, such as Jeroboam, returned and demanded constitutional rule, and in particular the lifting of the forced labor levies and high taxes. Now, therefore, make thou the grievous service of thy father and his heavy yoke, which he put upon us, lighter, and we will serve thee. There seems to have been a full-scale political conference in Shechem, in which Rehoboam, after consulting his father's old advisers, rejected their consolatory recommendations, and took a hard line, backed by his young knights, telling the northerners, "My father made your yoke heavy, and I will add to your yoke. My father also chastised you with whips, and I will chastise you with scorpions." This extraordinary misjudgment destroyed the United Kingdom. Rehoboam had not the military means and skill to hold it together by force. The northerners broke off and reverted to their own royal house, and in an age of rising empires, the Babylonians followed by the Assyrians. Both these small kingdoms, Judah in the south, Israel in the north, went to their doom separately. Yet the process of decline spanned several centuries, and in the course of it the Israelite religious culture underwent important changes. In the first instance, it was the northern kingdom which flourished. It was more populous than the south, had more fertile land, and was closer to the trading centers of the time. Free of the southern yoke, it grew richer and paradoxically followed the pattern of constitutional and religious development Solomon had found. necessary, and which, when imposed by southerners, it had rejected. Like the house of David, the northern house of Omri became centralists and imitated the political and cultural patterns of successful neighboring states. Omri himself was a formidable king, whose exploits were sorrowfully recounted in a tablet to the Moabite god Chemosh, which was discovered in 1866 and is known as the Moabite stone. Omri, king of Israel, oppressed Moab many days because Chemosh was angry with his land. And his son succeeded him, and he also said, I will oppress Moab. Omri, like Solomon, consolidated his power by judicious foreign marriages. He espoused his son Ahab to the king of Sidon's daughter Jezebel, thus linking his inland kingdom to the sea and its trade routes. Like Solomon, he was a great builder. On a hill at Samaria, from which the sea can be seen 20 miles away, he founded and built a new city. We can even date its foundation to approximately 875 BC. Like Solomon's royal cities, it had a fortified royal acropolis. Ahab, too, was a great builder. At Samaria, he constructed what the Bible calls an ivory house. That is a palace with a throne room lined with ivory carved in low relief, a luxury which only the richest kings of the time possessed. When Samaria was excavated in 1931 to 35, pieces of these ivory decorations were found in the rubble. Ahab, like his father Omri, was a highly successful warrior king who resigned for 25 years and twice defeated the king of Damascus, until, as the Bible says, during a chariot fight, a certain man drew a bow at a venture, and his arrow struck between the joints of Ahab's armor and fatally wounded him. But the house of Omri, worldly and successful like Solomon, also aroused bitter social and moral resentment. Great fortunes and estates accumulated. The gap between rich and poor increased. The peasants got into debt, and when they could not pay were expropriated. This was against the spirit of the Mosaic law, though not strictly against its letter, since what it insists is that you must not remove a neighbor's landmarks. The kings were opposed to the oppression of the poor by the elite, because they needed poor men for their armies and labor gangs, but any actions they took were feeble. The priests The priests at Shechem, Bethel, and other shrines were salaried, closely identified with the royal house, preoccupied with ceremonials and sacrifices, and uninterested, so their critics claimed, in the distress of the poor. In these circumstances, the prophets re-emerged to voice the social conscience. Like Samuel, they were uneasy about the whole institution of monarchy, perceiving it as inherently incompatible with the tradition, was suddenly reinvigorated in the north by the astonishing figure of Elijah. He came from an unidentified place called Tishbe in Gilead, east of the Jordan, right on the fringes of the desert. He was a Rehabite, a member of the ultra-austere, wild, and fundamentalist sects, an hairy man, and girt with a girdle of leather about his loins, like nearly all Jewish heroes. He came from the poor and spoke for them. The tradition said he lived near the Jordan and was fed by the ravens. No doubt he looked not unlike John the Baptist 8,000 years later. He worked miracles on behalf of the poor and was active in times of drought and famine when the masses suffered. But of course, Elijah, like other strict worshippers of Yahweh, was critical of the house of Omri, not just for social, but above all for religious reasons. For Ahab neglected the cult of Yahweh and slipped into his wife's cult of Baal. But there was naught like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. And he did very abominably in following idols. It was Jezebel, too, who tempted Ahab to possess himself of Naboth's vineyard by an act of despotic power, and Naboth being sent to his death, a crime against the whole ethos of the Israelite theocracy. It is evident that Elijah could rouse a mass following, especially in time of hardship, when no rain fell. He was a formidable public preacher. Chapter 18 of the first book of Kings describes the dramatic scene when he gathered an immense crowd of Israelites on Mount Carmel and challenged the priests of Baal and the prophets of the grove, which eat at Jezebel's table, to a rain-making contest. His aim was to settle the religion of the people once and for all, saying to the assembly, How long halt ye between two opinions? If the Lord be God, follow him, but if Baal, then follow him. The priests of Baal went through all their rituals, cutting themselves with knives and lancets till the blood gushed out upon them, but nothing happened. Then Elijah built his altar and offered sacrifice to Yahweh, and immediately the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice. Then all the people fell flat on their faces and said, The Lord, he is the God. The Lord, he is the God. Elijah and his mob took the pagans priests to the Kishon brook and slew them there. And after further prayer on the summit of Carmel, Elijah summoned up a little cloud out of the sea, like a man's hand. Soon the heaven was black with clouds and winds, and there was a great rain. Despite the triumphant vindication, Elijah was unable himself to eradicate paganism or destroy the house of Omri, though he predicted its downfall. He was a lone figure, a charismatic man capable of swaying a huge crowd, but not one to build up a party or a court faction. He stood for the individual conscience, perhaps the first man in Jewish history to do so. God spoke to him not in the thunder of the Mosaic era, but in a still small voice, in his cursing of Ahab's line over the killing of Naboth. He upheld the principle that a king's behavior should be no different from a private man's. It must be guided by moral principle. Politics was about right, not might. But Elijah, though the first prophetic leader of the opposition, was not a politician. Much of his life he was a hunted fugitive. His last days were spent in the wilderness. Chapter 2 of the second book of the Kings tells how he anointed his successor Elisha before being swept up in a whirlwind and mounting to heaven in a chariot of fire, leaving behind for his heir to don his sacral mantle. Elisha was of a different cast, however. The Bible narrative shows him performing remarkable acts when mocked by little children or possibly teenage roughs near Bethel. He summoned 2 she-bears from the wood, which tore to pieces no less than 42 of the delinquents. But Elisha did not operate alone. He created an organized following, a college of prophets, and he worked with elements in the secular establishment to obtain the religious reforms Elijah had demanded. Ahab had maintained and enlarged Solomon's chariot cities in the north. He and his successors had a large professional army, a source of both strength and weakness. Among the successful chariot generals was Jehu, son of Nimshi, who driveth furiously. Elisha engaged in a religious military conspiracy with Jehu, had him anointed the future king, and thus set in motion one of the bloodiest coups in history. Jehu had Jezebel thrown out of the window of her palace by her eunuchs, and some of her blood was sprinkled on the walls and on the horses, and he trod her underfoot. Ahab's 70 sons were decapitated and piled in 2 heaps at the entering of the gate. Jehu massacred Ahab's entire royal house and all his great men, and his kinsfolk, and his priests, until he left him none remaining. He then assembled and slaughtered all the priests of Baal, and they break down the image of Baal, and break down the house of Baal, and made it a draught house unto this day. The ferocious religious purge may have reestablished the official sole worship of Yahweh for a time, but it did not resolve the perennial conflict between the need to maintain religious orthodoxy, to keep the people together, and the need to confirm to the world to keep the state in existence. Jehu was, as was foreseeable, was soon behaving in as arbitrary a manner as the house of Omri. Indeed, virtually all the kings of Israel broke with the religious purists sooner or later. To preserve his power, a king, or so it seemed, had to do things that a true follower of Yahweh could not countenance. The episode of Naboth's vineyard was a case in point, a symbol of the spiritual secular conflict. There is a famous passage in which God inspires Elijah to say to Ahab, "Hast thou killed, and also taken possession?" And Ahab answers, "Hast thou found me, O mine enemy?" Merely replacing Ahab's sons by Jehu and his sons did not solve the problem. It is restated in a rather different form in the 8th century book of Amos. This book is contemporary with Hesiod's works and days in post-Homeric Greece, and shows a similar concern for abstract justice, though in the case of Amos, it is associated directly with the worship of Yahweh. Judah, a dresser of sycamore trees, who came north to Israel to preach social justice. He was at pains to point out that he was not a prophet by birth and belonged to no college, just a simple working man who saw the truth. He protested about the elaborate ceremonies conducted by the priest at the northern shrine of Bethel, which he said were a mockery when the poor were downtrodden and starving. He has God saying, I despise your feast days. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy viols. But let judgment run down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream. Amaziah, the head priest of Bethel, objected strongly to Amos's activities. The shrine, he argued, was the king's chapel, part of the king's court. The duties of the priests were to uphold the state religion with due decorum, and it was not part of them to play politics and interfere in economic processes. He said to Amos, O thou seer, go flee thee away into the land of Judah, and there eat bread and prophesy there. To the king, he complained that Amos had in effect raised a conspiracy against him in the royal precincts, adding in a significant phrase, the land is not able to bear all his words. The debate was, and indeed is, important. The later Jewish seers, and in their turn most Christian moral theologians, endorsed Amos' view. The Talmud laid down, the commandment of righteousness outweighs all the commandments put together. But the Talmudists have the responsibility of holding the state together. That was all in the past, and they could now afford the luxury of moral absolutionism. In Amaziah's day, however, a compromise between the secular and spiritual authorities was essential if the state was to survive at all. If prophets from the south were allowed to go around stirring up class warfare in the name of God, the community would be fatally weakened and at the mercy of its external enemies, who would wipe out the worship of Yahweh altogether. That was what he meant when he said that the land could not bear Amos's bitter words. Through the 9th century, the power of Assyria had been growing. The black obelisk of Shalmaneser shows that, even in Jehu's day, Israel had been forced to pay tribute. For a time, Israel bought the Assyrians off, or formed coalitions of other small states to halt their advance. But in 745 BC, the cruel Tiglath-Pileser III ascended the Assyrian throne and turned his warlike race into a nation of imperialists. He inaugurated a policy of mass deportation in conquered territories. In 740, his annals record, As for Menachem, king of Israel, terror overwhelmed him. He fled and submitted to me silver, colored woolen garments, linen garments, I received as his tribute. In 734 he broke through to the coast, then advanced down it to the brook of Egypt. All the elite, the rich, merchants, craftsmen, soldiers were transported to Assyria and resettled there. In their place were established Chaldean and Aramaean tribesmen from Babylonia. Then Tiglath pushed inland, stricken internally by religious and social divisions. The northern kingdom of Israel was in no condition to resist. In 733 to 734, Tiglath-Pileser conquered Galilee and Transjordan, leaving only Samaria. Tiglath died in 727, but his successor, Shalmaneser V, took Samaria in the winter of 722, and the following year his successor, Sargon II, completed the destruction of the northern kingdom, removing the entire elite and sending in colonists. I besieged and captured Samaria, Sargon records in the annals of Khorsabad, carrying off 27,290 of the people who dwelt therein. The second book of Kings echoes mournfully. So Israel was carried out of their own land to Assyria unto this day. And the king of Assyria brought down men from Babylon, and from Cuthat, and from Ava, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria, instead of the children of Israel. And they possessed Samaria, and dwelt in the cities thereof. There is abundant confirmation of the catastrophe in the archaeological record. At Samaria, the royal quarter was totally destroyed. Megiddo was leveled, and new Assyrian-type buildings set up on the rubble. The walls of Hazar were torn down. Shechem disappeared completely. So did Tisra. Thus the first great mass tragedy in Jewish history took place. It was, too, a tragedy relieved by ultimate rebirth. The Holocaust dispersion of the northern people of Israel was final. In taking their last forced journey into Assyria, the 10 tribes of the north moved out of history and into myth. They lived in later Jewish legend, but in reality they were simply assimilated into the surrounding Aramaean population, losing their faith and their language, and the spread of Aramaic westwards as the common language of the Assyrian Empire helped to conceal their evanescence. In Samaria, Israelite peasants and artisans remained and intermarried with the new settlers. Chapter 17 of the second book of Kings, which records these melancholy events, says that while the exiled elite in Assyria still worshipped Yahweh, they sent back one of their priests to live in Bethel and instruct the leaderless people. But it adds, "Howbeit every nation made gods of their own, and put them into the houses of the high places, which the Samaritans had made." And it then paints a fearful picture of the confused paganism into which the northern kingdom collapsed. The way in which the north had worshipped Yahweh had always been suspect in Judah. This doubt about northern orthodoxy reflected the division of the Israelites which took place at the time of the entry into Egypt, and which was never really healed after the Exodus, and the conquest of Canaan. In the eyes of Jerusalem and its priests, the northerners had always mingled with the pagans. The fall and dispersal of the northern kingdom and the intermarriage of the remnant with aliens was used to deny the Samaritans their original Israelite heritage. From this point onwards, their claim to be part of the chosen people and to inhabit the promised land in full righteousness of possession was never again acknowledged by the Jews. Yet the North left a legacy to the South, which was to provide the germ of a new phase of the religion of Yahweh, flowering in the South during the last days of Old Jerusalem. When Samaria fell, some literate refugees escaped the deportations and came south, where they were received and resettled in Jerusalem. One of them brought with him the writings of an obscure prophet called Hosea, which were then put into shape by a southern hand. Hosea had been prophesying and writing on the eve of the destruction of the northern kingdom. He was the first Israelite to perceive clearly that military and political failure was an inevitable punishment visited on the chosen people by God because of their paganism and moral failings. In a brilliantly written and often poetic text, he predicted the fall of Samaria. God would break in pieces their idols, for they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. And to all the sinful worshippers of Yahweh he warns, Ye have plowed wickedness, ye have reaped iniquity. Hosea is a mysterious figure, and in some ways his writing is among the most impenetrable in the whole Bible. His tone is often dark and pessimistic. He had the power which was to become characteristic of so many Jewish writers, to convey the sense of having suffered, yet to have retained an inextinguishable spark of hope. He may have been a reformed drinker and womanizer. He laments, whoredom and wine and new wine take away the heart. Sexuality, in particular, arouses his intense loathing. He says that God told him to marry the whore Gomer and have children by her. Gomer standing both for the ritual prostitutes of the pagan temples and for Israel herself, who left her true husband, Yahweh, to fornicate with Baal. He denounces all the institutions of the North. Indeed, he thinks the North should never have existed at all, since Israel and Judah were properly one. Political solutions were useless. Jehu's purge was wicked. The organized priesthood was a scandal. As troops of robbers wait for a man, so the company of priests murder in the way by consent, for they commit lewdness. The colleges of prophets at the royal shrines and elsewhere were no better. The prophet also shall fall with thee in the night. The prophet is a fool. The spiritual man is mad. So Israel, with its existing institutions, was doomed and would be carried away into exile. But in the long run, this did not matter, for God loved his people. He punished, but he forgave. He hath smited, and will bind us up. Then, in a strikingly prophetic phrase, he adds, In the third day he shall raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. But what mattered was not material preparation, but a change in human hearts. It was love for God, the response to God's love for us, which would ensure Israel's redemption and enable a purged and purified remnant to carry the faith into the future. This remarkable message, in which for the first time an Israelite thinker seems to envisage a religion of the heart, divorced from a particular state and organized society, was received in a Judah which was terrified by the collapse of its northern neighbor and feared a similar fate. Judah was poorer than the north, more rural, less dominated by military power politics, and closer to the roots of Yahweh worship, though both the Bible narrative and the excavation of Jerusalem in 1961 to 1967 provide evidence of backsliding into paganism. The ordinary people of the land, the Amharites, were important there. They made their first appearance in history in 840 BC, when they overthrew the despotic queen, widow, Athaliah, who seized the throne and introduced Baal worship into the temple. The second book of Kings makes clear that in the constitutional restoration which followed, the notion of the theocratic democracy was revived. For it was a man of religion, Jehoiada, who led the popular uprising, and he insisted that the people should be recognized as a political and constitutional force. And Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the Lord's people, between the king also and the people. In no other country in the Near East at that time, or even in Greece for long after, could such a novel arrangement have been drawn up. Indeed, as the shadows of imperialism fell on Judah too, the Amharites was given the specific right to elect the king of the succession to the throne was in doubt. When Israel fell, Hezekiah, king of Judah, whose professional army was meager and much inferior to the old chariot army of the north, used the support of the Amharites to refortify Jerusalem by building a new wall on the western ridge. He set to work resolutely and built up all the wall that was broken down, and raised towers upon it. And outside it he built another wall. He also prepared against an Assyrian siege by driving through the Siloam tunnel, which took the water from the Gihon spring into a cistern cut into the rock, a channel then carrying the overflow into the Kidron brook. The town had access to this vast cistern without besiegers being aware of the arrangement. This too is described in the Bible, and was strikingly confirmed when the tunnel was explored in 1867 to 1870. A contemporary inscription recording the completion of the work in Hebrew was found on the walls. This is the story of the boring through, while the tunnellers lifted the pick each towards his fellows, and whilst 3 cubits yet remained to be bored through, there was heard the voice of a man calling his fellow, for there was a split in the rock on the right hand and on the left hand, and of the day of the boring through, The tunnelers struck, each in the direction of his fellow, pick against pick, and the water started to flow from the source to the pool, 1,200 cubits. Jerusalem did, in fact, survive a fierce siege by the Assyrian king, Sennacherib, in 701 BC. The instrument of salvation was not so much the new walls and cistern as a violent outbreak of bubonic plague, carried by mice, which struck the Assyrian camp, to which the Greek historian Herodotus later referred. In the second book of Kings, it is seen as miraculous. And it came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 180,500. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. The rulers of Judah also sought safety in various alliances with small neighboring states, and even with vast feeble Egypt, the broken reed, on which, as the Assyrians sneered, if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. Increasingly, however, the rulers and peoples of Judah began to link their ultimate political and military fate with the current theology and moral behavior. The notion seems to have spread that the people could only be saved by faith and works, but the concept of a religious solution for the national problem of survival, the very opposite of the idea which drove Israel into kingship at the time of the Philistine invasion, itself drove Judah in two divergent directions. How could Yahweh most effectively be appeased? The priests of the Jerusalem temple argued that it could only be done by destroying, once and for all, the suspect cultic practices of the old high places and provincial temples, and concentrating worship solely in Jerusalem, where orthodoxy could be maintained in all its purity. The process was accelerated in 622 BC, when, during repairs to the temple, Hilkiah, the high priest, found a book of ancient writings, perhaps the original text of the Pentateuch, perhaps just the book of Deuteronomy, giving the covenant between God and Israel and culminating in the terrifying curses of chapter 28. This discovery created panic, for it seemed to confirm Hosea's prophetic warnings and suggested that the fate of the north was about to be visited on the south. The king Josiah rent his clothes and ordered a total reform of the cult. All images were destroyed, the high places closed down, pagan, heterodox, and heretic priests were massacred, and the fundamentalist reform culminated in a solemn national celebration of the Passover, of a kind never before staged in Jerusalem. Hence, by a curious paradox, the chief beneficiary of this return to the roots of the nation's religious past was the Jerusalem temple, introduced as a quasi-pagan innovation by Solomon. The power of its priests increased sharply, and it became the national, or at any rate the official, arbiter of all religious truth. But in this doom-laden period, a second and unofficial line of thought began to express itself. It pointed to salvation in quite a different direction, which was eventually found to be the true one. Hosea had written of the power of love and called for a change in men's hearts. A younger contemporary of his, a southerner, carried these ideas further. Isaiah lived at the time when the northern kingdom was under sentence of death. Unlike most of the heroic figures in the Bible, he was not born poor, according to the tradition of the Babylonian Talmud. He was the nephew of King Amaziah of Judah, but his ideas were populist or democratic. He put no faith in armies and walls, kings and magnificent temples. His work marks the point at which the Israelite religion began to spiritualize itself, to move from a specific location in space and time onto the universalist plane. It is divided into two parts. Chapters 1 to 39 deal with his life and prophesying in the period 740 to 700 BC. Chapters 44 to 66, or Deutero-Isaiah, date from much later, and the historical connection between the two is not clear, though the development of the ideas is logical enough. Isaiah was not only the most remarkable of the prophets, he was by far the greatest writer in the Old Testament. He was evidently a magnificent preacher, but it is likely he set his words down in writing. They certainly achieved written form very early and remained among the most popular of all the holy writings. Among the texts found at Qumran after the Second World War was a leather scroll 23 feet long, giving the whole of Isaiah in 50 columns of Hebrew, the best preserved and longest ancient manuscript of the Bible we possess. The early Jews loved his sparkling prose with its brilliant images, many of which have since passed into the literature of all civilized nations. But more important than the language was the thought Isaiah was pushing humanity towards new moral discoveries. All the themes of Isaiah are interrelated. Like Hosea, he is concerned to warn of catastrophe. Watchman, what of the night? He asks. Watchman, what of the night? Foolish men take no notice. They say, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Or they put their trust in fortifications and alliances. Instead, they should obey the Lord's command. Set thy house in order. This means a moral change of heart, an internal reform for both individuals and the community.